So I want to start off by talking briefly about how I came to this subject. It's something of a personal story, but I think it's a good way of opening up into the larger subject of the book. So, rewinding a couple of decades ago, I was a recent college graduate at the just having graduated from the University of Michigan, which is also Professor Khalil's alma mater. And I was now working in Chicago, and this is in the early 2000s as a management consultant. So one Friday, I was sitting in a mosque on the north side, listening to a sermon, a khutbah. The preacher, a well-known Sufi sheikh in the local Muslim community, proclaimed that Muslims must be different, not just on the inside by cultivating virtuous character, but on the outside as well, by dressing distinctively. Delivered as the US government was launching its post 9/11 war on terror and intensifying its surveillance of American Muslims. The sermon urged the congregation to resist the mounting pressure to assimilate. I listened attentively, waiting to hear how the Sufi sheikh would draw from the Islamic tradition. But instead of citing the Quran, he invoked the charismatic authority of the Prophet Muhammad, citing hadiths that urged Muslims to be different from Jews and Christians, including the well-known saying, quote, "Whoever imitates a people becomes one of them," or in Arabic, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum," implying that if Muslims copied the ways of other people, they would eventually become like them and lose their religion. Being different, he argued, was in fact an Islamic doctrine. But as I left the mosque that day, I was still not convinced. If Muslims must indeed be different, how different must they be? That question lingered in my mind as I made the decision later that year to change my profession and enter the academy. I enrolled in Duke University's graduate program in religious studies with a focus on Islam. The sermon in Chicago on Muslim difference inspired a term paper that gradually evolved into a PhD dissertation directed by my advisor, Professor Ibrahim Musa. Although I was initially reluctant to devote several years of my life to this subject, during a visit to Princeton University, Professor Michael Cook convinced me that this topic was indeed worthy of my time. Quote, "It would be like throwing a small brick into a large window," end quote. With a small act of destruction in mind, I opted to undertake my dissertation research at the Asid National Library in the ancient city of Damascus, home to a monumental yet unpublished manuscript of the Ottoman Arab Sufi jurist Najm ad-Din al-Ghazi. The civil war that would soon engulf the country had yet to break out, although some signs indicated that all was not well. So I eventually completed the dissertation. I'm very grateful for that. And then took a job at the at Lafayette College. Eventually, took a job at Lafayette College in the Department of Religious Studies, where the dissertation seeded what is now the book, and that the cover that you see before you in this presentation. So that's how I came to the subject, and how it sort of a personal and a pivotal moment at a time that I had no intention of becoming an academic, seeded itself or presented itself to me several years later and became the book that is before you today. So I wish to start, beyond sort of my personal account of how I came to this topic with a quotation that I begin the book off with. And it is by Muhammad Asad, who is a famous, well-known European Muslim who died in 1992, if I'm not mistaken. And he was born Leopold Weiss. So he was one of into a Jewish family and converted when he was young. Probably one of the most important European Muslims to live in the 20th century. And he composed a book, his first book that was published at least, called Islam at the Crossroads. And in this work, he states, or he writes, quote, "The imitation individually and socially of the Western mode of life by Muslims is undoubtedly the greatest danger for the existence, or rather the revival, of Islamic civilization." And what he ends up doing is citing this hadith, this statement that I mentioned to you earlier: "Whoever imitates a people becomes one of them," or "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum," transmitted on the authority of Abdullah ibn Umar and collected in the by Abu Dawood in this famous hadith compilation. So this statement, he argues and goes on to state, is uh, not only a moral admonition, but also an objective statement of fact. In this case, the fact of the inevitability of Muslims being assimilated by any non-Muslim civilization, which they imitate in its external forms, end quote. In other words, to unpack this gloss, the hadith, the statement attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, is both descriptive and prescriptive. In other words, it describes descriptively an objective phenomena in the world, that when an individual emulates or imitates another group, that he or she eventually begins to acquire key attributes that belong to that group and become like them. But it is also prescriptive in his reading, and frankly, in the reading of many of those who came before him who read this tradition, and in particular as a warning. So, in other words, as a warning to beware and be careful of imitating, quote unquote, them. And in Islamic tradition, and in the tradition that eventually evolved around this text, it most often was concerned or directed towards Jews and Christians, fellow people of the book, although it also encompassed a whole host of religious and non-religious others. So the upshot, and I should say that, in other words, what emerged or what evolved was not merely the hadith, but an entire discourse that emerged around the hadith, one that prescribed a whole set of practices that I will later speak about. And today, in terms of thinking about the significance of it, it's not only an issue of early Islam, but it's also a matter that connects and relates to the conditions facing Muslims today in Muslim majority and majority and and minority contexts as well. So, for example, such as whether it's okay for Muslims to celebrate Halloween or Christmas, or how to dress, for example, among other subjects. This is a topic that comes up frequently. So the upshot for Muhammad Asad is that based on this particular reading of the hadith, quote, a Muslim must live with his head held high. He must realize that he is distinct and different from the rest of the world, and he must learn to be proud of his being different. He should endeavor to preserve this difference as a precious quality and pronounce it boldly to the world instead of apologizing for it and trying to merge into other cultural circles, end quote. In other words, what he's calling for is a kind of Muslim pride, for Muslims to come out of the proverbial closet, as it were. And look, in 1933, when he's writing this, in the interwar period after the fall of the Caliphate, in 1924, and in a period in which European colonialism was still being experienced by different Muslim communities across the globe, this idea of preserving what made Muslims unique and special was very much in the air, not only in the Muslim heartlands, as it were, but also even in Europe to folks like Muhammad Asad. So this discourse, this doctrine, helped to support this idea of being different. So this is actually one popular image of Muhammad Asad dressed in Arab garb. And this harkens back to his famous autobiography, for which he is perhaps best known. He also has a translation of the Quran, which is also well known. And he spent about 6 years traveling in Arabia. And this image or this photo harkens back to this moment. So people might think that, okay, he normally dressed in Arab garb, or garb that would present him as conspicuously Muslim. However, that would be actually an incorrect assumption to make. This is a sign of what is called Muhammad Asad Platz, which is just outside the United Nations and Vienna, and was posthumously erected. But it signals that Muhammad Asad was in fact a cosmopolitan figure. and not a quote unquote fundamentalist, as some might presume by a surface level reading of his statements. Rather, he was well versed in 7 or 8 languages, and was pivotal in the founding of the nation of Pakistan. So Muhammad Asad, the figure, as one person said, he was one of us and he was one of them. He was a liminal figure in a different view. This is actually Muhammad Asad Platz today, which is a site of protest and certain limited forms of public expression in Islam in Vienna. And this is actually another photo of Muhammad Asad um, on Radio Pakistan. And this was more commonly how he would dress as a normal, not say normal, but as a European, so that it wasn't evidently or conspicuous to the viewer that he is quote unquote Muslim, at least from visibly speaking, that is. So this space of contradiction between his exhortation to Muslims to be different, including external difference, and his own practice, I think is a good space to kind of open up and enter into the subject of Muslim difference and think about the paradoxes and the complexities and nuance that are really required to better understanding what is happening. Now, I want to take a step back and briefly speak about imitation, which is also very much at the center of this book, conceptually speaking. So here you can see copycats. I guess that's one way of thinking about imitation. Now, I wish to sort of start off by citing the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant, one of the pivotal figures in the European Enlightenment, and a key figure in exhorting and endorsing, as it were, the defense of reason and the exercise of reason as opposed to tradition. He said, or wrote, quote, "Genius must be considered the very opposite of the spirit of imitation," end quote. And I include this, I cite him because he represents a spirit of thinking that emerged in modernity that began to look at imitation, denigrate imitation. And this is a shift. This is a shift in thinking and perception of imitation and emulation, more broadly speaking. In many pre-modern societies, the idea of emulating the past and authorities of the past was pivotal to the positioning of various thinkers and believers within a particular tradition. However, in modernity, with a growing emphasis on individualism, on reason, as opposed to tradition, as opposed to religious tradition, the views on imitation, mainstream views on imitation, and took a turn, a downward turn, if you will. And so what my book does and what I try to do is, as it were, to rethink, or at least begin to recuperate imitation as a concept and then as an idea. One of the reasons why is because when thinking about imitation and doing so, it reminds us that we are in fact social animals. Who we are is very much determined through our relations with others, humans and even non-humans. It is in some ways a misperception for us to think that who we are emerges within a vacuum, or that we are islands. And that's just not how things work. And imitation reminds us that we are social animals, that who we are is defined through our relations with collectivities. This is one video which I hope comes through that highlights the importance of imitation and how it takes root at a very young age.
He's my boy. Oh, bless you. How's the baby? Bless you.
And so what you just saw is in the background, their father of these twins sneezing, and then the twin to our left sneezes in imitation of his father, and then the twin to our right, in many ways, sees the positive affirmation that the mother is giving, and then proceeds to simply imitate everyone. It goes achu achu achu, and this is a powerful a powerful example of how imitation works and begins working at a very, very young age, in terms of defining our behavior and who we eventually become. Even something like sneezing, which we normally conceive of as a biological function, can be transmitted and circulated socially and therefore culturally. Now, what I want to do is now pivot back to the Arabic term, or pivot to the Arabic term, which was cited in the hadith and mentioned in the hadith. Man tashabbaha biqawmin. The Arabic term is called tashabbuh. And I translate it, I usually translate it as imitation. However, its semantic field is actually much broader and expansive, and includes terms such as mimesis, simulation, assimilation, and resemblance. So it's, however, I've chosen, or at least to use imitation or imitate as a translation most often, because imitation brings to the surface the importance of intention, the idea that imitation may be intentional or unintentional, say compared to a term like resemblance, which some people prefer. However, in different contexts, I do use some of these other translations. So I just want to highlight the fact that tashabbuh, its semantic field, is more expansive than the English term imitation, to highlight the importance of this Arabic term, and also appreciating its uniqueness. Now, one definition of tashabbuh in Arabic is given by Al-Ghazi, Najmuddin Al-Ghazi, who died in 1651, an important Ottoman Arab scholar whom I speak of in my book. And he says that he says that it is human sometimes by artifice, or sometimes by artifice or deceit, to be a likeness of the imitated. Shib al-mutashabbaha bih. And this definition is important because it highlights the fact that, someone is imitating to become like something else. But the idea of shib al-mutashabbaha bih, using this particular construction, suggests to me, in my reading, that Ghazi is also trying to draw our attention to the fact that one can attempt to imitate an original or model, but one can never truly, as it were, become exactly identical to that original. There's always something of an ontological gap. And I think that space, that gap, is also important to acknowledge and take note of. So what I want to do in my book is I argue that we should not only talk about Muslims and Muslim thinkers like they're museum pieces in the past, but I argue that we should think with them. And so that's one of the reasons why I attempt to put into conversation Muslim thinkers, such as Najmuddin al-Ghazi, with European or North American thinkers from the global north, as it were. So Michael Walter Benjamin, a German Jewish intellectual from the 20th century, argued that mimesis is to become and behave like something else. And this definition was adapted by the anthropologist Michael Taussig, who argued that mimesis is to explore difference, yield into, and become other. And I think, putting, Ghazi's definition in conversation with these definitions helps us to realize and appreciate the conceptual connections between imitation and difference. And more broadly, to think of tashabbuh, the Arabic term tashabbuh, as a transformative technology of the self, to think of imitation as a transformative technology of the self. In other words, a form of, as contributing to subject formation, or in more maybe slightly cruder language, self-development. I don't prefer to use that language. What also, and I think really helped to develop my interest in the subject is that imitation and difference, for that matter, brings into relief the importance of identity and alterity in Islam, that the self and other, or relations between self and other, how the relationship between self and other, us and them, is configured. It also brings into relief and puts and highlights the seamless, as it were, interaction between it was conceptually and as a practice, becoming, belonging, and identity. So we can speak of these concepts, which were very important concepts and significant concepts when speaking of human behavior. It helps to bring these concepts into to see them as working as connected processes, rather. So becoming subject formation, belonging, what it means to be part of a community, and of course, identity, who we are, who we become. It puts these processes into conversation with one another. And it also brings into relief connections and relations between religion and culture. So conceptually, the concept of tashabbuh, the idea of imitation, is very exciting because it helps us to think about these concepts relationally and critically. Now, what I want to do is, since we've just reflected a bit on imitation, and its significance, we can appreciate why Muslim thinkers then were very much interested in regulating it and thinking about it and talking about it in relation to what it means to be Muslim. But beyond that, I also wish to highlight the fact that tashabbuh is not the only vernacular, not the only vocabulary in which Muslims across time and place talked about imitation. So what I want to do is speak of, or at least position and contextualize tashabbuh within a broader discursive field, if you will. So we can think of imitation, and this is a bit oversimplified, but I think I wish to sort of help you as the viewer and on the audience to better understand its positioning within the broader framework of Islam. Islam is can be understood as a negative form of imitation. This is how many, if not most, Muslim thinkers thought about it across time and place, but not exclusively. However, positive imitation is also conveyed in other key Arabic terms, other key terms within the Islamic tradition. One of them is called ittiba' sunnah, or following the way of the Prophet. And this was drawn from the Quran and generally viewed to be a positive kind of imitation, that emulating the prophetic model would allow someone to live one's best life. And taqlid, another key Arabic term often used in legal contexts to signal the importance of conforming to a particular legal school to ensure consistency and stability in Islamic law and ethics, was also viewed as generally a good thing. An ordinary believer, Muslim believer, should do taqlid of a particular legal school. Now, the asterisk that you see by tashabbuh and taqlid is meant to highlight that these terms were not exclusively negative or positive, respectively. Especially in modern times, reformers critique taqlid as contributing to a jumud, or a kind of a freezing, solidifying, stagnation of Islamic thought. And tashabbuh in other contexts was viewed, especially among Sufi thinkers, as something positive. However, in this dominant register that I explore in the book, you can sort of see how imitation, if conceived as negatively, as bad, can also be synonymous with the idea of being different. And this is what we find in much of the Islamic tradition, Islamic scripture, even while there's nuance, which I speak of in the book. but we can understand why this register, the idea of being different, often was spoken of in the register of imitation. It helps us to make sense of that. So what emerged after early Islam and the canonization of hadiths, right? And it is mainly in the hadiths that we find Muslim, at least scriptural statements on imitation. It helped inspire later Muslim thinkers who wrote what I call treatises against imitation. And we can conceive of these treatises within a global framework because treatises originate from multiple geographical locales in which Muslims lived: the Levant, Arabian Peninsula, Europe, West Africa, North Africa, and South Asia. Authors include all-stars such as Ibn Taymiyyah, Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi, Najmuddin al-Ghazi, Usman dan Fodio, Qari Muhammad Tayyib, Muhammad Asad, Ahmed al-Qumari, and many others. These are just some of the figures, and folks who are familiar with the Islamic tradition will know many of these names. Most treatises were composed in Arabic, but also Ottoman Turkish, Urdu, and English. And some Arabic texts have been translated into English, modern Turkish, and Indonesian. One thing that surprised me when doing my research, and is certainly something worth a further inquiry, is that most treatises were actually composed after European colonialism, not in pre-modern times. And I think that speaks to the traumas of colonialism, and this perception that imitation mediated relations of power. And that's something that I also speak of in the book. And I highlight or bring to attention the insights of Ibn Khaldun, one of the most famous pre-modern Muslim social thinkers, who in his own way spoke of imitation in relation to power disparities between conqueror and conquered. And I think this insight very much is important for thinking about imitation and the original, and power relations between these two groups, subordinate elites, etc. And I think it helps us to understand anxieties among many Muslim thinkers and ordinary Muslims over imitation taking place as a result of European colonialism. Now, just for a broad comparative perspective, and this is not something I'm going to spend much time on, within Rabbinic Judaism, one finds a parallel concept and inspired by Leviticus 18:3, you shall not follow their laws or customs. And that inspired the doctrine of Hukat HaGoy or Hukat HaGoyim, the laws, customs, and ways of the Gentiles. And Beth Berkowitz, a professor at Barnard, has written a monograph-length book on the subject called Defining Jewish Difference from Antiquity to the Present. One may see some kind of inspiration there, a tashabbuh, if you will, in my own choice of title. And although her research, I think, and her mode of inquiry is more within legal studies, and mine is indebted, I think, more to sociology and anthropology, or at least I draw more on those disciplines to make sense of how Muslims talked about the subject. But I wish to draw your attention to this. Now, just for just perspective, because I realize that for those of you that may not be familiar with Islam or have a deep awareness of Islamic studies, one may think that this discourse suggests a Muslim antipathy to the religious other. And that is not what I argue is the case in my book, even though some people, I think, do interpret based on these traditions and this discourse that is the case. So in chapter 1 in the book, I have a chapter called Turning Away from Christians and Jews, ? And I won't go into detail here about that chapter, but I just want to highlight a few key points. So one can, when thinking about the Quran, right? And so when looking at Islam and what normative Islam or Orthodox Islam is, one must, or at least one can or should, look to the Quran, at least in part, to think about what that is. And the Quran, and I think this is important to take note of, alterity in the Quran, in other words, otherness in the Quran, is a continuum. So we can, if there's a self in the Quran, the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, the mu'minun, there are various sorts of others that are spoken of in the Quran, ranging from proximate others to distant others. And so it's incorrect to conclude that otherness in Islam is a black and white, us and them construction. That's not how the Quran, or for that matter, many later Muslims inspired by the Quran and later tradition spoke of non-Muslims. And this is conveyed in the term people of the book, right? This is a key term in the Quran to speak of primarily Jews and Christians, the Ahlul Kitab. And Kitab is an Arabic term that can mean divine writ, scripture, book, and is often, or at least spoken of as the Quran itself. The Quran speaks of itself as a kitab, as a scripture, as a divine writ. And by calling Jews and Christians the Ahlul Kitab, it's actually an honorific and an acknowledgement to their claim to divine revelation. And it's what I would argue is a connective term, because the Ahlul Kitab in the Quran are portrayed as the proximate other. And the term Ahlul Kitab itself, as a label, conveys this connectivity that the followers of Muhammad, the Mu'minun, have with Jews and Christians in their various manifestations. So I think that perspective is really important to keep in mind when thinking about tashabbuh and how it mediates relations between Muslims and non-Muslims, and helps us to make sense, I would argue, or at least put into broader discursive and social context Muslim writings on imitation. As one contemporary scholar puts it, we can share bread and a bed with fellow scripturaries, i.e. Jews and Christians, and there can be close neighborliness and conviviality. So the idea that at least Muslim men can marry Jewish and Christian women and eat together with one another is a way in which the Quran attempts to convey this closeness or nearness or intimacy that can be shared between Muslims and non-Muslims. So the upshot is that Muslim identity is not intrinsically oppositional. That would be, and some people draw those conclusions based on the discourse on imitation. But this is why it's important to look at the bigger picture when speaking of normative Islam. What practices does tashabbuh as a reprehensible form of imitation include? And this is where I draw primarily on the hadith to come up with this list. So they encompass both ritual and cultural practices. So ritual practices such as manner of ablution, wudu in Arabic, prayer, salah, even the call to prayer, the adhan, manner of fasting, saum, but then entering into the social realm and cultural realm, such as greeting formulas, how you greet someone else, holidays and festivals, whether Muslims can participate in festivals of other religions and other religious communities, funerary rites. This is a big thing in terms of shaping and configuring public life. Sartorial matters of dress and hairstyle, and even matters of eating. And this is just a basic list, as you were, or way of conceptualizing some of the practices, the corporeal practices that were encompassed by this discourse, by this tradition, and not exhaustive. So these are a couple of examples from the hadith literature that speak of, for example, beards, and help to contextualize how beards became, as it were, among Muslim men, a common style. So one tradition states, do not imitate polytheists, grow your beards and trim your mustaches. Another states, dye your beards, be different from Jews and Christians. So if we can recognize that in the Near East, there were various ways of and various styles of shaping one's facial hair. These hadiths suggest that the early Muslim community were not oblivious to this and wished to, as it were, express their own distinctive style. And these are traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, which suggests that he exhorted his followers to style their facial hair in a particular way, specifically to grow out one's beard and to trim one's mustache. And even though the Prophet Muhammad is not known to have dyed, right, his beard a particular hue using various forms of dyes that were available at that particular time, it is nonetheless understood by many Muslim thinkers that he encouraged Muslims to distinguish their beards from those of Jews and Christians by dyeing or coloring them. And this is a practice that Muslims even do today, inspired by this hadith tradition. But this gives you an idea of the language and the kinds of practices that we find in the hadith literature that speak to this idea of being different and distinct, and employing terms such as la tashabbahu, do not imitate, and be different, khalifu in Arabic. Now, what this brings to the fore, and one of my main arguments in the book that I hope readers and listeners will take away, is that the body is significant. This draws attention to the body in terms of mediating Muslim difference in public life, and a majority of the practices that come under the ambit of tashabbuh involve the physical body and corporeal techniques, sartorial styles, particular gestures. And so this is something that I highlight in the book when talking about Muslim identity and Muslim difference, that it's not just a theological thing, at least in this particular discourse and in this particular register, it directs our attention to the physical body. And to help make sense of why many of these practices may appear to be small, quote unquote, and I mean small, I draw on Sigmund Freud's theory of narcissism of small differences, which argues that individuals and collectivities seek or attempt to distinguish themselves from those other entities that are most similar to them. And so it might make sense then, given the proximity that Jews and Christians have with Muslims, that the discourse on tashabbuh focuses on Muslim relations with these two communities, although it's not exclusive to them. And I think Sigmund Freud's theory, despite its limitations, helps to illuminate the rationale, or at least why this takes place. Now, just a few comments on Muslims living in the West and the concluding chapter, right? And I've really only just touched upon some of the main topics I address in the book. But I want to speak briefly about Muslims living in the West, just given the context. And I sort of one of the concluding points or key points that I try to make based on my overall assessment of the Prophet's behavior and upon Muslim thinkers and how they talked about Muslim difference, I argue that the Prophet's efforts to define the line between insiders and outsiders were not spectacular and oppositional, but carefully calibrated into small differences, which drew upon a cultural ecosystem of symbols that paradoxically connected them to the cosmopolitan societies they inhabited. By drawing on existing social norms to define Muslim difference rather than importing foreign norms wholesale, the Prophet transformed these boundary regulating practices into connective practices that gave the Ummah, the Muslim community, a sense of place in the world, a pragmatic approach that can serve as a model for Muslims, American Muslims today. And so there's the constructive dimension to the concluding part of the book. So I shift from a descriptive register to a more of a constructive register in the conclusion. That's an attempt to begin to rethink what Muslim difference may mean for Muslims today, especially living in non-Muslim majority countries. So one of the appeals that I make is to see the other in the light of God, and I cite, or at least one can draw upon this Quranic verse, for example, which speaks of the people of the book in a differentiated way, as diverse. So in other words, there are folks that are exemplars and who are religious others, and Muslims can look to them for inspiration. And so this is one way to reread this particular hadith tradition today, rather than viewing them primarily as as carrying a negative moral valence. And in other words, suggesting that non-Muslims are not worthy of imitation. Rather, one can read it differently today. And this is an appeal that I make in the book to help Muslims construct, or at least help to construct a kind of cultural citizenship rather, in the nation state context. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 5:15. So hopefully I've done a good job of staying within the time. And so yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Patel. Very, very interesting. At this time, I'd like to invite attendees to type in questions in the Q&A. If you're on a smartphone, you might have to look for it. You might have to look for the three dots, and then you can find it from there. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I guess I'll begin with some questions. First of all, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. And I think that your conclusion helped me to sort of frame this to kind of think through this, because one question that I had was, when you look to the hadiths, so for example, the hadith about combing your hair differently. So the Prophet is instructing his followers to comb their hair differently so that they stand out, so that they're unique. But there are other things that clearly would have been that they would have shared with non-Muslims. For example, the way I assume some articles of clothing that they wore, others would have worn them as well. So your conclusion sort of helped me to sort of think through that there are maybe just certain distinctive things. And it was interesting that in the, so I guess what I would be curious to know is how you analyze, so you have this hadith, comb your hair a certain way, and presumably there are articles of clothing that others are wearing, that the Muslims are wearing as well. And then you flash forward to Muhammad Asad, and he's telling folks in the West, even Muslims in the West, even, if I understood correctly, that they should wear distinctive clothing. But maybe I misunderstood Muhammad Asad. But I wonder, how would you sort of assess the ways that sort of the evolution of this way of thinking?
Sure. Well, I mean, in the book, I traverse kind of a long historical trajectory. So I not only look at early Islam and how the Prophet himself may have employed this idea of being different in into the trajectory of his own life in light of historical studies of early Islam. I then move fast forward to looking at the partisans of Hadith and the role that they played in shaping this doctrine, and then to folks like Ibn Taymiyyah in Mamluk Damascus, and Najmuddin al-Ghazi in Ottoman Damascus, and Muhammad Abdu in early 20th century Egypt. So there's a long kind of journey and a long conceptual journey that I take in the book. So thinking about the trajectory, one of the things I do assert is that the Prophet was very selective in identifying particular practices to mark the early Muslim community. And some look at those hadith traditions out of context and think that Muslims must be intrinsically oppositional. And that's the way, that's what the Prophet was exhorting his followers to do. But when you look at, the actual practice of early Muslims, and when you look at the broader sort of canvas of even Islamic scripture, and I just gave you one example from the Quran, for example, you see that that was not the case. So as you correctly indicated, the Prophet himself was Arab, and he wasn't ashamed of being Arab, and was visibly Arab, and that didn't, and so this idea of being different didn't mean he in having conversations with God, right, and interacting with God and preaching this message of Islam didn't sort of mandate that he became an alien to his people, at least culturally or in terms of attempting to differentiate himself in that way. So this is something that I speak of. And then when we look at early Muslims, and even as something as developing the sort of skill set, as it were, to run an empire, there are so many practices that they acquired from the existing practices of non-Muslims in order to learn how to run an empire, a caliphate, which they had to learn how to do from the Byzantines and from the Persians. And I speak of those affinities in the book. So, and then when we look at Muslim thinkers across time and place, there was an emphasis, or at least the idea, that physical appearance mattered, right? And this is something that we see in the Hadith traditions. And so a question facing Muslims today is, does physical appearance and distinctiveness still matter? And it's a difficult question because even in the figure of Muhammad Asad, we have something of a quandary in that he's exhorting Muslims in Islam and the Crossroads to maintain even their aesthetic uniqueness, and kind of draws an important connection between aesthetic sensibilities and one's moral values. But then we see he himself in his ordinary conduct dress, at least when living in Europe, and even elsewhere, as dressing in a European style. And I think this brings up the challenges of speaking about this topic. So, kind of fast forwarding to modern times, there are some scholars, jurists, that I would argue have a minimalist approach to tashabbuh and say that it doesn't really encompass physical appearance anymore, or at the very least will portray the tradition as saying that it never really did, and focus mainly on arguing that tashabbuh only applies to ritual practice, that one cannot import practices from elsewhere and change how you pray or how you fast, for example, fundamental ritual practices. However, there are other jurists that do not hold that position and still argue that Muslims must be visibly different. And you can argue that's kind of a maximalist position, if you will. And so many Muslims are still draw on that tradition to argue that the kind of Muslim difference is not merely interior or internal in terms of the acquisition of pious virtue, tazkiyat and nafs, but also should manifest externally and publicly and visibly as well. So we find both, as it were, in the public forums on what constitutes Orthodox Islam today. But I sort of advance a particular argument in the conclusion of the book that states that at least within the nation-state context, at least within the United States of America, Muslims should feel free, as it were, or empowered. I think that's a better word, empowered, to figure out what Muslim difference and uniqueness means to them and how they wish to manifest their Muslimness in public life. So if one wants to wear a green turban and a green thobe because one is sort of in fana of the Prophet or infatuated with the Prophet Muhammad, as it were, then at least within the United States, and that's what the person wishes to do, and that coheres with their agency, then I wouldn't condemn that. Or for that matter, a Muslim who wants to sort of stay on the down low, and who's more low key in cultivating a religious identity that is not so visibly, not so blatant, as it were. So that's one of the arguments I make in the conclusion of the book is promoting Muslim agency.
Very interesting. First, I should tell you, we've gotten some compliments here. Thank you to everyone involved in bringing this information to us. And thank you for this informational webinar. We have some interesting questions here also. Let me begin with this question here. Thank you for your talk. I'm curious about the place of or possibility of individuality within this system of differentiation.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's precisely one of the arguments that I make in the conclusion of the book. Because in some ways you can argue that one of the functions of the exhortations to be visibly different is for a kind of Muslim solidarity, or at least that's one of the byproducts. There's a kind of Muslim solidarity. I was just at Princeton the last week, and one of and this kind of stuck with me, is the Muslim Students Association. Some members told me that they have a new, as a custom, if you want to call it that on every Thursday, men will wear a kufi, a hat, to visibly indicate, or at least inform the Princeton University public of their Muslimness in an attempt to show solidarity with Muslim women who wear the headscarf, especially since October 7th, where being visibly Muslim has draws attention, and often negative attention. So I thought this was quite interesting, and as a conscious communal effort of that particular community to use Muslim difference and visible Muslim difference as a way of manifesting social solidarity in a difficult time for the Muslim community. So I think this is one example of how the kind of individualism, as it were, does it mean that this should be duplicated everywhere else? No, because contexts are different. Islam in France and being Muslim publicly in France, for example, given sort of the laws instituted in that country is different. One cannot have a one-size-fits-all sort of solution, as it were, to this issue. So given the nature of the modern nation state and the emphasis of modernity on cultivating and empowering sort of individual agency, this is something that I think is the type of approach that would make most sense, especially Muslim minority contexts, such as the United States, to empower ordinary Muslims to figure out how they wish to cultivate their Muslimness in public life, rather than enforce crudely a kind of one-size-fits-all solution. I think that can be very damaging. In fact, given the diversity across gender, across ethnicity, across class and status, the diversity of the Muslim community in the United States. And so this is something that I think is very important.
Thank you so much. This next question is, apart from people of the book, Jews and Christians, what are dynamics of interaction with members of other religions, Buddhists, Hindus, etc.? Has there been a more restrictive mindset? Would they be understood in a different category than, say, atheists?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And, I do think that, this is a very important topic, given the fact that Muslims across time and place not only encounter Jews and Christians, but encounter atheists. They encounter spiritually but not religious Buddhists, Hindus, etc. And we see a variety of responses by Muslims across place and time to the particular situation that they find themselves in, given their religious context. So, for example, Islam in South Asia, and in India in particular, where Muslims are a significant number, but nonetheless a majority. The kind of discourse that has emerged there around Islam and Hinduism is quite differentiated. So the subject of tashabbuh does come up in terms of Muslim relations with Hindus, and a recent publication by Sher Ali Tareen called Perilous Intimacies, I think, looks at some of the conversations on imitation of South Asian Muslims in relation to Hindus. But, technically speaking, would certain other categories be viewed as Ahlul Kitab or people of the book? Not traditionally. Now, are some contemporary Muslim theologians beginning to rethink these categories? Yes. One example is the theologian that I mentioned, T.J. Winter or Abdul Hakim Murad, whom I cite in the conclusion of the book, who speaks of the British Muslim context, in which a significant number of British are no longer really believers. So then he argues that contemporary Muslim theologians must cultivate, or at least develop, a theology that helps, or that better places atheists and agnostics, as it were, within a quote-unquote Islamic framework. So he comes up with a term, I think a clever term, called Ahlul Kidhab, or Kidhab, the people, deniers, as it were. But by coming up with that term, in some ways he legitimizes this category, and one which emphasizes their shared humanness, or humanity, with Muslims, and the fact that all human beings, as it were, are infused with a divine spark, or the light of divine creation. And so this is one way in which you have a contemporary theologian beginning to kind of really rethink these categories, or at the very least, think of new categories that help to foster Muslim relations, cordial, productive Muslim relations with non-Muslims. So this is something that is evolving. And I think with regard to these other communities, Buddhists, Hindus, you're going to find a variety of thought and practice across across time and place.
Very interesting. Well, we are unfortunately out of time, but I do want to thank you, Professor Patel, for a very interesting presentation and a very interesting book that you have published, that you have produced. And I know you've been working on this for a long time, and this is a groundbreaking book, and one that is, you know, receiving a lot of accolades, and rightfully so. And we really appreciate this contribution, and want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Professor Khalil, for having me. It's wonderful to see you again, and it's a great opportunity and an honor to be able to speak a bit about the book. And you know, if anybody wants to contact me and have further questions and conversations, feel free to email me.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Professor Patel, and thanks to those of you who attended, and that will conclude our session. Thank you.
Thank you.